whether it's being of a certain race? What is it about these certain identities that lead us to be viewed as less human and less people? I think this is a better area for inquiry because it completely abandons the need to define identity in any like super hardcore way. And we can instead focus on the fact that people deserve like their humanity and autonomy to be respected. If I'm a conspiracy theorist who believes in like 5G, right? I truly believe that. It has nothing to do with the argument. I disconnect from reality and that I don't also believe that the ground for truth is possible, right? A lot of people say we live in like a post-truth society.
And so this is a big issue that I have when I debate people on the very extremes of the left or right, is that it feels like you almost have like these epistemic divides where you actually have totally incongruent views of the world.
How dare you dog me for 50 minutes to play League of all things.
I didn't know the last game was going to last so long. You didn't respond when I messaged you. Okay,
lost.
It took a long time.
You dogged me to lose.
Listen.
You didn't even win.
Yeah, well, that's because I wanted to punish myself for keeping you, okay?
Okay, good. Should I cancel now?
Oh, no, don't cancel.
Oh, no. Okay, I won't cancel. I'm mad, though. I was going to come in all friendly. I was going to be like...
Good, be mad. Last time we had a friendly chat, Booksmarts got real upset about it, so go ahead. Unleash, okay? Okay. No, actually, I don't want to be too mad. That's on me. Okay, how you going? Other than being a loser. I'm going fine. How are you doing?
I don't... Oh my God, you're so rude.
I don't. Okay, sorry, what's up?
You're so rude.
Okay, you wanted to talk about identity. What does that mean? Like identity politics or critical race theory or puberty blockers for children?
Obviously, all of these things, I defend them to my death, obviously.
Of course you do.
No, I want to talk about... Fuck you. I want to talk about gender shit today.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I like to loop back into a conversation 2 weeks after it's done.
Cool.
Yeah. So I listened to you talk to Rem and Howarth. And I had some thoughts, and then I listened to Rem talk to Demon Mama and Doe.
Rem and who?
Howarth. Perspective philosophy. Howie.
What a name. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so some things I want to clarify. First of all, the gender question actually breaks down into 3 separate questions, right? The ontological question, ontological meaning of being. When I clarify things, it's not because I think you're an idiot. If that's what I think, I will just tell you that.
Sure. I mean, because I obviously know, like, ontology has to do with the nature of, like, the being of something. It's a subset of metaphysics, of course. Yeah,
I know,
of course. Yeah, So go ahead, break it down for the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So ontology, so like questions about being. Epistemology, questions about knowing, and ethics, so questions about like what we ought to do. So the ontological question is, what is gender? The epistemological question is, how do we know our gender? And the ethical question is, how should we treat people's claims about their gender, right? And to me, a lot of the time, these arguments come down to like the ethical question, which is totally unrelated to what the discussion ends up being, which is ontological and epistemological. So
I'm happy that you think that. It's very cute that you think that any other fucking human being could ever separate the ethics out from any other part of this question. But
yes, no.
I think that the ultimate encapsulation of the breakdown of like not being able to distinguish between like the epistemic idea of gender versus like the ethical treatment of gender is that one phrase: trans women are women. Because like within it contains, you have like the epistemic and the ethical are like both contained in that statement, and if you deny either end of it, you're absolutely fucking lambasted. But yeah.
Okay, I agree to an extent, but I think when I'm talking about the ethical question, I'm talking about how you treat, like if someone says that they're a woman, what do you, like, how you treat that? Do you then go into the ontological and the epistemological and go, well, actually you're not a woman because blah, blah, blah. It's like, if I'm speaking to you and I say, hey, Stephen, what do you want to do today? And you say to me, I want to play League. And I say, I think you actually want to play a different game. Trust me, you deep down, you want to play a different game. You want to play something like Untitled Goose Game. Ultimately, I have to respect that you are the authority on what you want and how you feel, right? So
wait. Okay, hold on. I have to, I need 100% of my brain power when talking to you. I'm going to take notes for when we talk about this. Okay, I like to go line by line. If I interrupt too much, you can tell me to shut the fuck up and you can finish your point, okay?
I will.
Okay, Jesus. All right. So related to that question of you have to respect that somebody says they are what they are. So obviously my contention is going to be somebody says they are something that they clearly aren't. So somebody says like, I am a table. So what is your engagement with that question? Yeah.
Okay, so that's, to me, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe we can't separate things as easily as I would like to. If someone says they are a table, right, this to me is epistemological because gender is more of a psychological state than it is a natural fact. So it's more like saying I can know if I'm in love through introspection, right? But no matter how hard I introspect, I can't know the weight of my own brain. So there are certain things that you know based on like objective criteria, and there are certain things which are abstract and more felt, right?
Sure.
So there are, of course, cases where like, let's say Melina was like, oh my God, I'm obese. I have absolutely no muscles, right? There are objective criteria where you could say, this is not true. Like there are, of course, cases where someone can create dysmorphia in their minds.
Yeah, fuck. I was going to say that's a hard one to go by because like eating disorders and body dysmorphia, there's a whole bunch of shit that goes into there. Where like
that's a whole thing, right? Like dysmorphia means that you can show, like you can't convince them, but we know objectively that an anorexic who says they're fat, for instance, is not fat, right? I could go around and say I am Destiny the streamer. And people could say, no, we know who Destiny is. These are the objective facts about that person. But when it comes to saying something like I'm in love or I'm a woman, these are things that we introspect our way to. They're not the same. So if someone says they're a table, obviously they're not a fucking table. That has nothing to do with agentic identity, which is sort of what Rem was getting at with Demon Mama. It's not to do with agency. It's to do with it being a psychological state.
Yeah. So okay, now I'm gonna push in a little bit harder here because I'm curious. So so if I try to draw boundaries around some of the things you've said, so we can't just identify as anything because there are some things that aren't identified by their state of mind, but rather solely by physical properties. So for instance, somebody says identify as a chair. Yeah, exactly. We don't have an identity of like a chair. There's no psychological identity of a chair. So I agree with you there. So now we've gotten rid of, so we've drawn a circle now around some identity things and we've gotten rid of all things without psychological states, right? So I'm curious now. So if I try to narrow this a bit more, what about people that say, for instance, that they identify as like a dog or a cat, that psychological state? How do you begin to address something like that? So there is a physical and a psychological inside process for a dog, and we don't have access to anybody else's internal like thoughts or content. How do you address that? Yeah, where do you go from there? Yeah.
Okay, so two things. Firstly, this is why I brought up the example of like an anorexic who believes they're fat, right? It might be true that there is misattribution, but we don't want to use like this misattribution as a starting point for reality. That's a huge concession to give to the world, the idea that people can be wrong about how they feel. The idea of someone identifying as a dog.
I would challenge that, but go ahead.
Well, just chill for a second.
Okay. I think we should be able to tell some people that they can be wrong about how they feel, but you probably agree. But maybe I'm nitpicking. But go ahead. I'm just trying to be careful with all our language. Go for it.
Yeah, you can of course tell people that their feelings are wrong. You can't tell someone that they're not 100% right about how they feel. And I'm not saying that is true of all cases. I'm saying if you generalize that out, that's a really dangerous. Like you're really messing with like the very ground of.
So maybe so to couch this a little bit more, like. Feelings are always valid, but just because you have a particular feeling doesn't mean that you ought not change that feeling or something. So for instance, somebody's feeling suicidal, that is a valid feeling you can have, but you ought to seek to change some of these feelings. Not all feelings are ought to remain. Some ought to be changed, right? I think we can agree.
No, I mean literally, this is the anorexic thing again. An anorexic can truly believe that they are fat.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that they are correct about that because we have objective categories for that, right? Like someone can feel suicidal, for instance, and we can know that the best thing for them is to probably tell them facts about reality, show them that there's hope, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I mean, it's a bit different when it's like a total medical condition about like purely feelings that are emotional, not like a psychological state. But, I mean, I agree with you on base that we can change people's feelings. What I'm saying is the difference between identifying as a gender and identifying as a dog is ultimately that you have to sort of refer to the existing matrix, right? So most people, when they have a gender identity, that relates in some way to the binary. Even non-binary gender identification is related to the binary in that it is non-binary, right?
When you say refer to the existing matrix, aren't we kind of begging the question? Because don't some people have identities by virtue of having that identity? They are challenging the matrix. So for me to say, well, hold on, we need to be within the matrix, I've already begged the question and I've already kind of like won the argument. So I don't know where we're going for this argument, but like some people will say things, for instance, like I've noticed how people identify as the audi gender. You can be like autistic gender, or people identify with these genders that don't exist within the matrix or the spectrum. So how do you attack people? Yeah. I say attack, that sounds mean, but how do you attack the argument that like you can't just identify as anything that doesn't refer to said matrix?
Yeah. Okay. So we weren't made for the categories. The categories were made for us. Mm-hmm. They're there to represent us in a judicial system so that when our rights are being impinged on, we have like a means for like study and activism, etc. Yes, the gender matrix is oppressive, right? And you can subvert genders and extend genders, but to identify as a table, I could strongman this. And there's a lot of like decolonial feminist work by like Maria Lugones or Gloria Andelzua, who talk about this idea of like pneumastesis, the fact that the gender matrix shits on our creativity and forces us in these oppressive ways into these genders. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, I think it's always a mistake to act like your gender exists for you in some sort of atomized way. Your gender exists within a system that relates to like big oppressive forces, big institutions, ideologies. And I mean, you can make arguments that identifying as a table or a dog or something. I really do not believe that there are that many people who do this, by the way. It is a very...
Yeah, I know. But so the issue is that I think in terms of like, I hope, I don't know anymore. But I think in terms of like mainstream thought, I'm pretty sure I align like 99.9% or with, I imagine with you and like what most mainstream people say when they talk about like trans identity or whatnot. But it seems like for a lot of the online conversations, as they become like increasingly more and more radical, and I don't know how much you caught of me in Rem's conversation, but now the new meme is that like every single identity is all equally valid and you can identify as whatever you want to identify as, and you are whatever you identify as. Like these are like axiomatic, like and it feels like starting from that foundation, you've essentially like everything is like absurd. So that's kind of the position that me and Rem were talking from in terms of how self-identity goes.
Yeah, and I think that might come down to like this break again. So like for instance, and I don't want to talk about her argument too much because I don't want her to feel like she can't defend herself. But we've spoken before, and I've spoken to Demon Mama.
What would be the problem with dear gender? Can anybody tell me if there would be a problem with dear gender? Is there anybody who could even do this? There would be nothing wrong with dear gender. Do you want to know why there would be no problem with dear gender? Because gender is a category of self-identification that means what you want it to mean. And it means what you engage. It refers to how you engage socially and how you assert your own identity. So yeah, it is fair to say that gender is essentially an aesthetic. There is nothing less valid about dear gender than there is about non-binary gender.
I think that Demon Mama is correct on epistemological grounds, right? That self-ID is probably the best thing we can count on when it comes to knowing one's gender. So a sincere self-identification.
I'm sorry. Oh my God, I'm cutting you off so much. Shout over me if I cut you off too much. So
I'm shouting over you now.
Okay,
just
go.
Wait 1 second.
Okay, go.
Okay. I think self-ID is correct, right? But as I have said to you before, and as I have said to her before, it is only part of the answer to the question. You still need to answer the ontological part of the question. Otherwise, you necessarily have an incomplete formulation of gender and it becomes circular, right?
Okay. Can you talk to us and tell chat for people that don't understand, can you explain the idea of like a private language?
Yeah, so a private language is to do with the fact that like if you use a word in a way that it only relates to like your understanding of that word, like most people acknowledge, in my opinion, in the place that I study, private languages don't really exist. They don't make sense. They're useless, right? Language is socially used, so we use it to communicate. And therefore, we need shared understandings of what words mean.
Sure.
That doesn't mean strict definitions. That doesn't mean a dictionary.
But some shared understanding.
We need to have a shared understanding. Otherwise, there's no way to communicate meaningfully.
So I'm curious. So the problem that I have on epistemic grounds is that if we say like all self-ID is valid, aren't we essentially engaging in some form of like private language there? Isn't that essentially meaningless?
I'm not saying, I never said all self-ID is valid. I said that when it comes to knowing one's gender, self-ID is the best thing that we have for that.
Oh,
right?
okay. So this is something, again, where I agree with you. I don't think we have any disagreement.
I have any disagreement on this, right?
Yeah, but that's not where the argument is. The argument isn't self-ID insofar as the existing gender matrix goes. It's self-ID for literally anything. That's what the argument has become. Because if it was just self-ID for gender, I mean, I'd argue without some incredibly sophisticated brain scan machine, which I don't know if it exists yet. Self-ID is literally the only point of reference we have for yeah. But
in the same way, like as being in love, exactly.
I feel like this is a big part of our conversation. If I'm pivoting too much to a different topic too, you can keep hammering this on it. It feels to me like gender exists in some kind of like special realm where there is like some internal understanding of gender that's a little bit separate from our other like internal understandings of things. So like, for instance, like I don't want to get into the whole like transracial thing, but I feel like you don't.
I want to talk to you about that. I've got a whole lot on that to talk to you about. Okay,
sure. So like, it feels like there is some internal understanding of gender that seems to exist on some like there's two poles between masculine and feminine or whatever. So I have a hard time grappling with people that start sincerely saying things like, oh, well, my gender that I self-ID with is like a deer or a cat or a dog or a table or can be anything. And then from that prior like axiom that is being laid out now, this idea that all self-ID is valid, not just all self-ID of a gender, but all self-ID period is valid. It seems like it necessarily becomes absurd almost instantaneously because anybody can self-ID as anything. There's no way to challenge anybody on epistemic grounds. It's unchallengeable. I don't know. I think, okay, so then you don't challenge it on epistemic grounds. You challenge it on ontological grounds. That's not a gender. A table's not a gender. Okay. But then if they disagree with you, what do you say?
Well, I mean, to me, and this is something else I wanted to bring up, right? In all of these conversations, I wanted to bring in gender metaphysics, which is a little bit controversial. Lots of metaphysicians hate it. Lots of gender theorists hate it. But I think it's interesting that it's never brought up in these conversations. So people like Butler and Haslanger, who are like cis women who work in this area, people like Robin Dembroff and Talia Betcher, who are trans people who work in this area, who are investigating what gender is, right? And how we understand gender. Sure. There is no one working in gender metaphysics that would take the idea that identifying as a table is something that you can do seriously. Now, there might be, and this is me strongmanning, the people that I talked about before, Maria Lugones and Gloria Andelzua, people who are working from post-colonial feminist grounds, might argue that you can create new mestizas, so creatively use language and ideas to challenge the gender matrix. The issue with these arguments ultimately is that when you try to push something from like an atomized liberal perspective where you're like, I am... I'm a dog and that's my gender identity. You are sort of doing a private language thing and you're also overestimating your own ability in isolation to change gender. There's a lot of work. So Butler's work really pushes on the idea of subverting gender, which is playing with the existing meaning of gender and extending it. So pushing the categories out. And that's something that I think a lot of people agree with as useful. But this idea of proliferations of gender as a way to sort of abolish gender, I just don't see working, and I don't think anyone in gender metaphysics would support it as a possible remedy to the current situation. Yeah, so ultimately as well, like sorry, just this, and it's going to sound. I want to clarify that in these conversations, I'm very careful when it comes to transphobia, right? You got to talk truthfully, but you also can't qualify every single statement. So if I say something transphobic, someone should totally call me out. That's fine. But for instance, in gender metaphysics, and this is not a transphobic argument, it's a basis for investigation. It is largely agreed upon that ordinary language views the definition of woman as ultimately coming back to adult human female. That's how we currently understand it to be. Before you can do any sort of prescriptive investigation, so like how things should be, you need to be very clear descriptively about how things are. And ultimately at the core of an identity of woman, whether it's right or wrong, most people, most ordinary people who aren't necessarily feminist or aren't necessarily involved in activism would relate gender to sex.
Yeah, I'd reiterate again that one of the frustrating things about having these conversations is that people can never separate the descriptive and the prescriptive. And if you list anything descriptively, you almost automatically get called out on like the assumption is that you're prescribing as well, which is very frustrating. Yeah, keep going. I guess there's a lot of like random stuff in here, but.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. Fuck. I say random stuff. Let me be more clear. There's a lot of like little things that I want to respond to. I just don't want to derail this too much. When you talk about the idea earlier behind like gender subversion, I'm drawing back on like conversations I've had on Twitter and then with all of these other people, the types of people that make these arguments. It feels like I have this feeling that like in the like early 2000s, and obviously these timetables are going to change based on where you live and whatever. So I'm being vague here, right? Early 2000s, gender subversion seemed to be like a thing that people were starting to push more and more and more. So the blurring between the masculine and the feminine, men started to like take care of their appearance. You had metrosexuals, you had earrings, jewelry. It was more acceptable for women to be tomboys. You had the Transformers movie, hot woman working on cars, stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. Not that any of these are perfect or whatever. It feels like we left the gender subversion thing though, and instead of trying to subvert gender, the new goal became to create like 4 million different genders. Or at least I'm being very clear. This is mainly just a Twitter thing right now. But so like, for instance, something that I've said before is, I've said this actually for a long time, before I even knew what the word non-binary meant. I've always said that I don't have like a specific attachment to my gender. If I woke up as a woman, I don't know if I'd care that much. It's not a thing I feel super strongly about. So like today, it feels like based on what I read online, that would be like a non-binary identity. But for my preference, I would just say, well, I mean, like I'm a man, but I just have like a less of a connection or attachment to these particular traits or whatever. But it feels like instead of like expanding some of these gender categories, the goal has become now to narrow them and then to create like a new gender category for every single type of feeling is like the feeling that I get when people talk about these things.
I think that's something you brought up, and I wanted to talk to you because you raised a question with Rem Howarth about the difference between a femboy and a trans woman, right? And
or
this
the male lesbians,
yeah, exactly. So like a butch lesbian and a trans man. At that time, the exact time you're talking about, something was going on in philosophy and trans studies called the Border Wars, right? So you had these two trans philosophers, J. Habelstam and Hale, CJ Hale, Jack Hale, I think. And they were discussing like what to do with this border zone, right? Because a lot of like butch lesbians, for instance, felt that trans men were betraying the gender by betraying women who had an alternate gender identity by transitioning. And then in the same way, a lot of trans men felt that butch women were just cowards who were too afraid to go through with the transition, right? So there was this big fight about where people fell. And ultimately what they resolved was the only difference between a trans man and a butch lesbian ultimately, other than their surgeries and all of that sort of stuff that someone might want to get. But ultimately, it comes down to self-ID, right? And they argued that this border zone should be demilitarized and that both sides should stop trying to like claim people who are sort of in this margin and in this gray zone, and instead just like understand that this gray zone could expand our conceptions. But yeah, exactly what you said has sort of happened in that instead it's become a highly militarized zone. Oh, it's Jacob Hale. Someone told me. Thank you so much, Hecuba.
So it's I can't believe you missed that name. Oh my god.
I know. Oh my god.
Man, we do a lot of Jacob Hale on the stream too, so I didn't want to say anything, but go ahead.
So instead it's become a highly militarized zone. Where people really fight to include people in their identities or create new identities and say, well, no, that's not a margin. That's not. And that is partly to do with like a huge thing in feminist metaphysics when looking at like how we ontologically understand what a woman is that people will be like, someone will come up with something. So like Sally Haslanger, for instance, says that a woman is defined by her oppression. Right? If you're oppressed in these certain ways, then you're a woman. Okay. And ultimately she gets in trouble because people are like, no, that excludes like, is the Queen of England a woman? That excludes certain trans women who aren't out of the closet or presenting as a woman yet, and they're still a woman. So like pretty much every single definition you get of woman suffers from the exclusion criticism. I haven't come across one that doesn't have the exclusion criticism, and that's because categories necessarily exclude. But it's like about having keeping space for the margins instead of trying to tightly define them. And I think that nervousness about the category and trying to be seen as part of the category has made people be really strict about category borders. Does that make sense? Sorry, I rambled at the end
I
a
think
bit.
I kind of understand. So like, I guess like in my, might just be aging myself or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not. Maybe I can't keep up with all the new the new hip wokeism anymore. Maybe I've hit my limit. But I guess like when I think of like an ideal world, if I'm looking at like the category of woman, I guess like ideally I would want half the population where on one extreme end of the spectrum you have the hyper feminized beauty pageant, like only cooks and cleans, has a baby every, like the ultra whatever the most trad con wife thing can be, right on that end. And then all the way on the other end, you have like the most like fucking butch lesbian, my aunt, butch lesbian, NYPD, does car work, housework, like cusses all the time, like tomboy as fuck, wears manly clothes all the time. But like all of these things would still be comfortably called like, oh, like it's all just different flavors of women or different types of women.
Yeah.
Whereas it feels like now, yeah, when you move to at least the extreme that's more towards the center, so between the feminine and masculine side, there's like 50 million different like new categories and distinctions that have been that have been created. So like, whereas it feels like, and now this is a conversation that's hard for me to have because we run into that epistemic problem where I make statements be like, oh, well, I can ideas anything. So it's oppressive for you to even say that. So I would say something like, it feels like there used to be women that would have just said like, oh, like I'm a tomboy, or, you know, I'm just like masculine, I don't give a fuck, whatever. But now it's like, I'm not a tomboy, I'm gender fluid, or I'm gender queer, or I'm non-binary, or I'm non-gender conforming, whatever. And I was like, okay, well, wait, well, hold on. Like, and then to go really far back, I don't make this argument anymore because we're so far past it, but to go really far back, these things like seem like they feed back in a very negative way and that they hardcore reinforce stereotypes, gender norms rather, that like you can't really have, there is no such thing anymore now as a tomboy woman. Now it's like a gender fluid, non-binary, agender, like it has to be something completely different now. And that gets really strange to me. Yeah, go.
Yeah, so a few things in there. Firstly, I think a big reason that people like the idea of creating new categories is that people like to be the center of their category. Yeah. It's not nice to be a marginalized part of someone else's category, to be seen as illegitimate in some circumstances or less than, or somehow not as authentic a woman or a man as other people in that category. So I think that is a huge motivation in the creation of new categories.
Sure.
And this is actually, it's funny to me. I really try not to bring up Wittgenstein, but we're here. It's the time.
Okay. Of course, it's always
so
the time.
Thank you. So obviously family resemblance is used a lot in gender theory, but a huge criticism of family resemblance is ultimately trans women are still going to be marginalized within the category of woman. It's still always going to center around adult human female, right? So the reason I think that there is a big push for people to create new categories is because they want to feel like the center of that expression. I think your bimodal sort of idea of gender is it can be even more wild, right? So the whole reason that Judith Butler started her study was looking at how queer subcultures subverted gender, right? So like the idea of like I could be hyper feminine and do that actually as a way of criticizing gender in and of itself, right?
Sure.
And so I think there's even more sort of aspects to that axis. And then in terms of people being more comfortable, I think there's also like there's just the history criticism, right? So trans as an idea, trans as a possibility is a relatively new thing, given that like a lot of surgeries are only newly available. A lot of the medical support for gender identity, sort of identifying as a gender other than your own, that is quite new. The idea that you even could be trans is something that is newly public, and the permissibility to exist in that way in the world is only just starting to become something, right? So it's really difficult to look at history and analyze whether we just gave up on extending gender categories and instead decided to reinforce gender binaries through like transgender sort of I'm just being careful because sometimes you're making a good argument and then you realize that it's starting to mirror like transphobic arguments. You just got to pull yourself back into line. But that is something like a lot of transphobic people in this space will even claim like, and I just like, want to say this is 100% not my view and not the view of the majority of feminist academia, but would even say that getting a surgery so that you are more like your gender, if you are a trans woman, which is obviously what these people are always concerned about, they're never concerned about trans men. Yeah. If you're a trans woman, then that's actually raping women because you're objectifying and embodying their bodies and you're making something out of their bodies, right? So like this idea of
I feel like
gender tourism is like a very toxic and transphobic idea. It's not that at all, right? It's that these things it's hard to look ahistorically and be like, oh, well, why didn't we want it back then? It wasn't available back then, quite simply. It wasn't in the public mind. There was an epistemic injustice that people felt a certain way about their body. And this is confirmed biologically and neurologically as well. And this isn't just like a cultural thing. People do feel really like certain things about their body. There's, of course, an expression element to gender. Gender expression is something. But in terms of the existence of trans people, that is something that has always existed, but maybe has not always been available to people.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with that. What do you think about the idea that I'm just curious what your thoughts are. I don't have like an argument or anything, just something I'm curious about. So I think that people previous to this have argued that we should be broader in terms of the types of shapes and sizes and the forms of gender expression that exist between men and women. That a lot of this is, say, socialized, right? I've made arguments like this. So, for instance, if I were to ask an average person, how do you identify a woman? Vagina is never going to be uttered. It's going to be things like long hair, soft skin, you shave, like the types of clothes you wear, right? Like these are going to be the things that this is how we identify men and women in society. We don't usually do a genital check. So if we've made arguments in the past saying that like we should broaden the expression such that like if a man wants to wear a kilt or a dress or whatever, that's fine. If a woman wants to have hairy legs, that's fine. How do we reconcile the fact that these are very like, I guess, fungible or intangible things that can be kind of like changed or moved, but then say that some people identify as a different gender and that feeling is so strong that their bodies have to conform absolutely with these other things that we said were more malleable? Does my question make sense?
I think I'm trying... Wait,
so
can you say the last thing?
Yeah. Okay. So, for instance, let's say that there is a cisgender woman, and she's born, and she says something like, I don't feel like a woman because like I've got really small boobs. That's something that like women that are small chested, that's like a big, like I won't say ego thing. It's like it's a very, very big personal problem that a lot of people have where if they feel like the boobs aren't big enough, they don't feel like feminine enough. Or they're not able to give birth to kids, or they're mad because they've got brown hair. So their leg hair is like very noticeable. They've got thicker, whatever, right? These are issues they have. Usually the things that you would say to somebody like that is like, okay, well, listen, you got to get chest implants. You got to do these things. Like you need to get this like gender affirming stuff to help you more identify as a woman. Instead, what we would usually say is like, okay, listen, just because you have hairy legs, it doesn't make you not a woman. Or just because you've got, smaller titties, that doesn't make you not a woman. But when it comes to like a trans woman, we would say, oh my God, you're absolutely right. You can't be a woman without these things. Like we need to do all of this stuff now to make you a woman. Like, how do you reconcile like both? This is like a very old question I've had for like 4 or 5 years that I've never really truly been able to reconcile in my head. How do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, I don't think you necessarily do reconcile it. To me, there's two separate things, right? There's a conversation about requiring people to do this to be read as a woman, which I just don't think holds, right? Because you can see a butch lesbian who is totally butch and often still identify that person as a woman, right? I mean, there are some places where they'll be misgendered, but you can generally, based on your experiences with women and your exposure to women, identify women regardless of like what sort of appearance they have, right? So I don't think it's necessary to have these sort of things to be read as a woman. Of course, we can talk about passing, which is different. But I think there's the separate conversation is what do you need in your body to feel like your body, like you want your body to feel, right? Oh God, that was a terrible sentence. What I'm saying is
You have an internal
who,
vision of your body. How do you make the external match like the internal?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
So like phenomenology of gender, they would talk about like, they would go into psychoanalytics. So like the study of like, mind, blah, blah, blah. And they would talk about like skin ego and your feelings of attachment to your body and like proprioception. And it's less to do with like, damn, I want a penis, and more to be like, I don't feel like, more like phantom limb syndrome, or more like there's something. And there's a big debates even within trans community about like the argument of like the wrong body. Some people are all about wrong body. Some people are not about wrong body at all. So it's definitely not a concrete thing. But I think separating the idea that society requires you to present in a certain way and the idea that you can want surgery because that will make you feel better. I'm not trying to make the assertion that society is requiring you to present a certain way. I'm looking at the phenomenological, your experience of your gender and that like internal feeling. And it feels to me, and maybe this has changed, or maybe it was never like this, and the conversation I heard are different. I could never imagine in the past where if a woman has like smaller breasts, like the advice that everybody gives her is like, oh my God, like if you feel small breasts, like that's fine. You can just get bigger ones. Go get a breast augmentation. Go get a breast augmentation. Go get a breast augmentation, right? You would never hear that, even though it feels to me. So like, here's a question. What's the difference between gender-affirming surgery for a cis woman who has small boobs versus gender-affirming surgery for a trans woman who wants larger boobs to feel more feminine? Because for the trans woman, we would absolutely say, not only like, is that GIS good? Like, you have a medical right to it. Whereas for the woman, I think almost all of us say, like, that's an elective surgery, dog. You want a boob job. What the fuck? Like, it feels like the reaction there would be totally different, but it feels like both of these people are doing this for phenomenological reasons, right? That the conscious experience they have of their gender, they're having this disconnect between the expression and the identity. But for one, we would encourage them to get surgery to match it, and the other we wouldn't. Yeah, why? How? I mean, look, I don't have a perfect answer for that. I reckon the medicalization. So in terms of like, the medical industry really supports the idea of like gender identity and these surgeries alleviating actual stress, right? Actual psychological pain, depression, all of these sorts of dysphoria and intense stress and pain are relieved by gender affirming surgery. I think you could probably make the same argument for cis women, sure. And like, I personally don't have a huge issue with people getting surgery, right? But ultimately, there is the idea, especially within feminist society, that women's bodies have been so hugely curated, like a woman remade into man's woman, right? Women's bodies are so curated by patriarchal society that a lot of the time it's about analyzing whether or not you want that for you or whether you want that because you feel that will make you more successful and more happy within a patriarchal society.
Yes, although
I get that the same is true of both, but I think
that sounds like a challenge almost on epistemic grounds then, right? Where like if we're trying to figure out the fact that like what do you actually want? Like, where does that desire come from? That it seems like that's unchallengeable.
I know.
Yeah.
And then you're ultimately like being paternalistic and telling a woman what she wants and how she thinks about herself and her body. And I definitely think that is true whenever giving individual advice.
Yeah. And
right?
so,
and I think you're 100% right on the individual level. It's more like the societal level where I would probably make a distinction.
Yeah. So like, for instance, so we say something like like, let's say that you had, I'm going to push a little bit hypothetically here, and then I'll bring it back to an incredibly obscure real world example. Let's say that we had a world where the surgeries were becoming way better, almost flawless, and now you're getting more and more trans women that are becoming like the spinning image of what, the ideal woman is. They're having perfectly flawless skin. They have perfectly regulated levels of hormones because they're on drugs for it. They have, awesome chests. They're, implants, and they're amazing or whatever. And now you're getting a bunch of cis women that are like, holy shit, like, we're getting fucked. Like, oh my God, like these people are more women than we are, right? Referring to trans women versus cis women, right? But they fit the ideal more because they've surgically adjusted themselves to be that way. So again, earlier, so you said like you never have huge issues with people getting surgery. I have pretty big issues with people getting surgery. That's easy for me to say as a man, of course. I understand that. But like, I think that I feel like the more technology we get and the more, I'm going to say women because really the image stuff affects women more than men for reasons that we probably both agree with. But like, it feels like women have been pushed more and more and more and more and more towards this hyper perfect image of what is a woman. So initially it was with makeup, then it was with surgery. Now it's with makeup, surgery, and like Instagram Instagram filters or Facetune or whatever, right? And it feels like, so I feel like there are issues with surgery where instead of, again, you know, if we go back 20, 30 years, instead of like broadening categories, like women can look like this or this or this, it's not actually like women actually can only look like this, and we're going to give you surgery to do it. And then when you take like trans women and you consider like the idea behind gender dysphoria, like now we have the name of a condition that exists where you are not expressing your gender to such a level that you require surgery to accomplish that point. And then my only question is, so why can't cis women at that point feel gender dysphoria? If you're a cis woman and you're not happy with your butt or the distribution of fat in your body, you got small boobs, why can't you have gender dysphoria like a trans woman does? I know these are really hard questions. I don't expect like perfect answers there, but these are kind of the things that bounce around my head on this. Yeah.
I don't have an exact answer to that question, but I have something that is related, which might be helpful. So I did want to talk to you and I'll get to it in a minute, about the false analogy between transgender issues and transracial issues, right? But Cressida Hayes, who is the person who works on that really well, she talks about the importance of analyzing the history. So like, for instance, gender and race are both socially constructed, but they're socially constructed in different ways. So our idea of what a cis woman should be and womanhood is constructed. That is different to a trans woman's experience, right? But Hayes talks about the ethics of transformation. So she says when we look at transforming a concept, or when we look at transformation generally, so for instance, transgender issues, we need to understand that there are, of course, progressive transformations, but there are also transformations which reinforce and reify the hegemonic and oppressive forms of whatever it is that we're looking to do, right? So yes, of course, if we have a bunch of trans women who are fucking getting these 20-inch waists and double D boobs and huge asses, right? Like, that is going to reinforce this view of women that is oppressive and that is already dominant and harms women. So we need to do this kind of we need to, and there's another person named Donna Haraway who has something called the Cyborg Manifesto, and she argues that like if we look at cyborgs, you're made with like parts of your oppressor in you. So it's about like understanding, like if you have a real desire to be a woman, and part of that desire is something like, oh, like I want to run around and wear makeup and feel pretty, you need to understand that even if you have that desire, like if I wanted to go and get Botox and I truly had that desire, I could get it, right? But I also need to understand that maybe I'm reinforcing something that is oppressive in making that choice. And there is an ethical consideration in the choices that we make. So I don't have a perfect answer. I'll think about it and I'll come back to you.
So like my big question basically relating to that, or like maybe an end stage is that like, and this is obviously impossible to answer, but like say you were born we'll say a trans woman. So you're born with a penis, but your internal gender identity seems to align more with that of a woman. But say you live in a society with a whole bunch of trans women and none of them do gender affirming surgery. None of them do hormone replacement therapy. Like they just like present a little bit differently. Would that person still feel body dysphoria? That's like a big question. It's obviously impossible to test, but yeah.
So I don't know perfectly because trans studies isn't my major area. But from what I know of trans studies, the body sensation, the phenomenology of gender is separate from gender expression. So people who feel a great desire to change their body, there are some trans people who feel no desire to change their body, who are more than happy to keep the bodily organs that associate with the sex they were born as, right? And that doesn't invalidate their gender identity. But there are people who feel extremely antagonistic to their sexual organs. And that I have heard is the case regardless of culture.
Yeah, so that thing, I've heard that. So I get a lot of really cool emails from trans fans that kind of talk about this stuff because obviously I don't understand it. And so I had an email from a person that said they had, for socioeconomic reasons, basically they had to cycle on and off of HRT. It was a trans woman, and she described the feeling of like just like looking at your body, because as a man you have fat in different areas versus a woman, that the idea of like watching some changes in her body was like this very like deep, like foundational, intrinsic, skin crawling, like horrible, disgusting feeling, but that still kind of like, that still raises the question where we go back to something you said earlier. Is that something that like specifically comes internally, or is that something that has been so heavily socially reinforced that we kind of like couldn't fathom any other way? There's that one quote, like we'd sooner recognize like the end of the world than like the end of capitalism or something, right? Like replace like capitalism with any type of like social or gender norm, you know? That's kind of my question.
This is okay. Once again, I'm so bad at directly answering your question, so I'm sorry for that. But it's also because I'm just like, so like, there's a word you use wrong sometimes. Not your fault. Everyone uses it wrong. So performativity, and book smarts use it wrong too, and that's because the ordinary language version and the philosophy version mean different things. And I'm sure you actually know, but it's just like it's so.
Yeah, to be clear, when I say performance, I'm not using this in a philosophical sense. I'm using the normal sense. Usually, when people talk about performance, they're talking about that you're intentionally acting in a way that doesn't adhere to like some internal. So if I lie about something, or if I'm acting like a clown,
it's superficial. Yeah, exactly. So that, but the issue is, and this is so like, as an ordinary language philosopher, I believe that lots of philosophical problems are caused by philosophers using words in ways that they're not used every day, right? So performativity comes from ordinary language philosophy, J.L. Austin, who says that language can both be assertive, so it can describe things, and it can do things. So that's performative language, language that performs a task. So I can marry someone with language. If I'm a judge, I can put down a sentence. I can make a promise. I can do things with language. Judith Butler then took this idea of performing with language and added that to gender performativity, right? And so this became the idea that gender is something. So we went from gender is something which you are, to gender is something which you become, to gender is something which you do. And now doing gender is really complicated because when people hear gender performativity, they think, oh, it's performance, right? It's like, I'm pretending to be a gender, or I'm doing this thing that is completely unnatural, right? Instead of thinking that a surgeon is a surgeon because he performs a surgery, a woman is a woman because she performs womanliness, right? Sure. Which is how it's meant. We instead view ourselves as standing outside a gender matrix and then deciding what gender will be and then doing that. But no one exists outside the matrix. And this is what you're talking about when you say like we can't recognize the end of capitalism, right? You are not born outside of the matrix and then gender is put on you. You are born into the matrix. So even, and I wasn't going to mention this, but I'm going to bastardize it just very quickly. So like a lot of, I know it's a big risk. Here we go. So for instance, a lot of people misattribute the sex gender distinction to Butler. Butler rejects a sex gender distinction. She believes that gender comes before sex, not the other way around, that gender is such a huge matrix upon which our world is built that even science and scientific discovery of sex already had gender in mind. And so sex is used as an a priori scientific objective grounding to reinforce gender ideology. So gender is so pervasive in our world that you cannot step outside of it. And the actions which you do create gender as a social construct, but also you have no ability to sort of control so that your actions come before your identity, and then your identity also influences your actions. It's cyclical.
Okay, it's almost, kind of, it almost reminds me a bit of like this. I don't know any of these things, but like kind of like this, it's like a companions and guilt argument, arguing that like, I think like ethics comes before epistemology or whatever, because some ethical consideration or some normativity always necessarily exists before some epistemic assertion. So it's similar here. So like, there's like some a priori understanding, or there's some, there's basically, you begin at the foundation of gender before any discovery or any normative statement can necessarily be made. Therefore, like gender is baked into everything. So obviously we would have a category of sex because gender exists prior to that or something kind of.
Yeah. I mean, and it's like, okay. It's always difficult, especially in spaces like Twitch, to argue things like, and I don't even like doing it now. So there is an element to which science is cultural, right? Science is culturally constructed because it uses language and it uses concepts which we gain through language, which is social. And you can go back to before like the Enlightenment or any period of like great scientific discovery, scientific revolution. You can go before that and know that we still have concepts of gender, which are largely based on obvious things like reproduction and sexuality, right? So we know that gender existed before the discovery of chromosomes, for instance. So yeah, I guess it is sort of like a companions in guilt argument. But anyway, she gets in a lot of shit from, I don't know, can someone in my chat, does Judith Butler identify with she, or is Judith Butler a they? But anyway, Butler gets in a lot of trouble with this, with trans people, and actually does something which I think is really cool for how we should be having these conversations. Can I tell you how cool this is?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, you excited?
Yeah. Does she create an alias on Twitter where she identifies as something so she can't be attacked for any of the... I'm just kidding. I'm so sorry. Go ahead. I'm being... I just had to throw that in there. I throw that in there to piss off book smarts. Okay, go
ahead. So instead of focusing on gender being something which we do, Butler moves after like 9/11 in a later work. Butler moves and focuses on undoing, right? Why is it that certain identities and expressions lead people to see us as less human? So what is it about certain things and realities about ourselves, whether it's immigrant status, whether it's being transgender, whether it's being of a certain race, what is it about these certain identities that lead us to be viewed as less human and less people? I think this is a better area for inquiry because it completely abandons the need to define identity in any like super hardcore way, and we can instead focus on the fact that people deserve like their humanity and autonomy to be respected. I think it's just more meaningful than constantly being like, what is it to be a woman?
Yeah, I guess, but now it sounds like we've almost jumped back into that area that we wanted to avoid before, where we wanted to have a very separate distinction between like the epistemic, the ontological, and the ethical, and now we're just saying, okay, well, let's fuck the epistemic and maybe fuck the ontological, and let's just only look at the ethical part of it, because if we try to address any of those other two areas, then we're going to smuggle in a whole bunch of really bad ethical statements without even wanting to. It almost sounds like that.
Yeah, I guess it is like that to an extent. I mean, and I think it comes down to like, why do you have categories? You have categories in order to get some sort of representation, in order to get your humanity recognized, right? So I mean, yeah, I think it's just something I wanted to put to you to consider.
Yeah. So the only issue, if we leave the whole world of philosophy and we go to the world of politics or rhetoric or policy debate or argumentation, the scary thing that I have when I have these types of conversations is as soon as you start seeding like descriptive grounds, or we can call them epistemic grounds or metaphysical grounds, as soon as you start seeding those and saying you don't want to talk about those anymore, somebody that is willing to grapple with that always has the upper hand, and then you necessarily lose. Yeah, it sounds bad, but if you don't ever want to have a conversation about like race or IQ or the safety of vaccines or whether immigrants commit crime, if you just want to move past that and go to the ethical statements, well, the people that are undecided, because in my opinion, a lot of the ethical statements, like a lot of these arguments come in the form of like begging the question, like, do you want to get rid of all the good immigrants from our country, where every immigrant is good, and like by definition, well, if they're good immigrants, we want to keep them, right? Like because other people that disagree with you are going to go back and they're going to argue on prior grounds that you've already said you don't want to discuss about. So if you cede that ground, then anybody that's not already bought into your arguments completely from the start is never going to listen to you, and that's kind of the issue that I have, or the worry that I have with with moving right to the ethical arguments. And
this is okay. Conversely, this is the issue that I have with the whole like argue every argument, right? First of all, if there's anything that gender arguments have taught me on Twitch, it's that most people arguing them are not equipped or actually care enough to have the argument, because like I've not heard like, and then this isn't to you because you argue everything, right? But like I've not heard.
Actually, no, I don't argue everything. I want to argue about that. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, very funny. So, but like people who are being very strict on this like idea of like what gender is, they don't engage with any of the literature or any of the existing understanding on gender at all. Like I never hear Hasslinger. I hear bastard bad versions of Butler. I never hear any trans philosophers brought up. No Betcher, no Salomon, no Dembroff. So like there are people, Hale, Halberstam, there are people who work in these areas who've dedicated their entire life to thinking about this question. And people are like, no, you know what? I reckon I can work it out here with you. And it's just like, it doesn't to me feel like a sincere care for the actual discussion. It feels like they more want to debate the politics. And that leads me to right back to where I love to be, Wittgenstein. Okay. And he talks about issues of certainty versus issues of like when you know something versus when you are certain of something. So if someone is certain of something, this is not based on argument. It is based on belief. And getting them to change their mind will look more like a religious conversion than it will an argument based on facts. If right now I was like, I don't have hands, nothing you could say to me would convince me. You could be like, touch your hands. Nothing you would say to me would be able to convince me that I have hands.
Okay. Am I not supposed to think about like the difference between like when you say that, does this like have anything to do with like rationalism versus like how, like what about things you know to be true via like deductive argumentation? Can you be certain of that, or is this like independent of all that?
No,
just,
but I mean like
phenomenological stuff or something?
No. Like, I just turned my screen off. Hang on 1 second.
Way to go.
I'm a pro streamer. Just wait. I can't see anything. It doesn't really matter, I guess. But I would like to be able to see shit, I guess. I'll just talk to you while I fix it. Okay. So, yeah, of course, there are things you can rationally deduce. I can rationally deduce that it's probably a great idea for everyone to get the vaccine. Right?
Well, hold on, wait. I just want to be really, really, really careful with my language. I'm sorry. When I say like rationally deduce, I'm talking literally like deductive, like prop logic, like if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. Like that's something that I can have a certainty about without having like a phenomenological experience of it or about it.
Oh, yeah. But it doesn't, it's not to do with truth. It's to do with belief, right?
Okay, which is something different here. Belief. Can you explain what you mean by that, just so I know?
Yeah. So truth relates to like fact and reality. Belief, if I'm a conspiracy theorist who believes in like 5G, right? I truly believe that. It has nothing to do with the argument. I disconnect from reality, and that I don't also believe that the ground for truth is possible, right? Like, so a lot of people say we live in like a post-truth society.
Okay.
So that is the post-truth is the idea that it's not an attack on a fact. It's not a fact versus a lie. Post-truth is attacking the very ground that make a truthful statement possible, right? So making people disbelieve in any sort of reality and ability to say anything in a meaningful way.
Sure. So just so we're clear, we have an understanding of this. So one of the ways that I say that people do this is the attacking of, say, academic institutions, where sometimes when it comes to certain things, these are only knowable because of like academic institutions giving us this knowledge. But when you start attacking the foundations, so lefties will say like, oh, we can't know anything because the whole economics institution is rigged. Or people on the right will say like, oh, you don't know anything about vaccines because all of the medical institutions are rigged by pharmaceuticals. Like if you attack on those levels, then you've essentially said that all of these facts about all of these topics are unknowable because some individual isn't going to know them, right? Or I guess they're knowable only via Facebook memes from your conservative Facebook.
Yeah, or like a really obvious example is fake news.
Sure.
The idea that things being reported are fake, and Hannah Arendt says that the enemy of truth is not a lie, but it is opinion. Because when I say something is my opinion, you can't say that it is wrong. It's just my opinion, and I have a right to have that opinion. So it's a huge thing, like opinion pieces, and the idea that every opinion is valid and you have a right to speak means that there are multiple truths, right? We live in a world of multiple truths where some things are true, some facts are truer than others. And this completely undermines the ability to use sort of like deductive logic on some things to convince people, because the premises you need to put forward your argument, some people will just not accept.
Yeah, and these premises, and so this is a big issue that I have when I debate people on the very extremes of the left or right, is that it feels like you almost have like these epistemic divides where you actually have totally incongruent views of the world, and there's no way to reconcile them because even on the most foundational points, you can't even start at any common ground. So like if I'm arguing with a Nazi, for instance, everything has already been tainted by the Jews. All of academia, all of media, like there's literally no point of commonality that we can work from. Like you're completely fucked right out the gate. So yeah, it's frustrating.
And so that's where Wittgenstein would say that changing someone's mind is less argument and more conversion. And this is why, like, I don't want to say I was talking about you. Don't get a big head. But like we were discussing you the other day in my server.
Of course you were. Yeah, go ahead. Wow, off stream in your server. Jeez. Okay, go ahead.
I know. It's like private memes. And I was saying that like when you talk to more extreme people, it has very like you are super good at arguing, right? And like your rhetoric is fire. I don't know, but like it's less to do with the strength of your argument and more to do with your reputation as like a logic bro and a cool guy, even though you play League. Like people like being part of your community. People want to be on your good side.
Oh my God.
So
Yeah,
when
keep
you
going,
talk
keep going.
to some of these people, yeah, shut the fuck up. When you talk to like some of these people, it's less that you've been able to argue them out of a position and more that they want you to like them. That leads them to soften some of their stances.
Sure.
I know that sucks a little bit, but
Well, I mean, like when it
like,
comes to argumentation, there's like a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it. I could even flip that conversely and say that like the reputation I have in some circles make it so that no matter what I say, they'll be disagreed with just because of the reputation.
100%.
Yeah.
You
so
could
for
say
instance,
something totally reasonable.
Yeah, if I were to tweet out something totally reasonable, like having sex with somebody without disclosing your genitals is tantamount to rape, people will have an issue with that. But I noticed that a relatively famous trans person on Twitter tweeted that out, and they got a whole bunch of agreement generally probably because of the differences of who we are. So yeah, of course, I definitely understand what you're saying.
And this is what I mean. It's like opinion and truth fight against. I fuck you. I know what you're doing as well.
No, but I understand what you're saying. When we were having a discussion, because obviously we're working on a higher frequency, of course, but it's way different than having a debate, like an adversarial debate. Like there are like 4 different fronts that you're working on there, and honestly, like the logic, the capital L logic, like the propositional logic, like the premise, that stuff is like way in the background. It's not really the most important part of that conversation. Like I would argue, actually, a lot of people said that I had a really good debate a while ago with Lauren Southern, and honestly, I think the thing that helped the most there was the fact that we were both parents, because that's like a really easy bond to hook in on. Like, hey, I've got a kid, you've got a kid. I'd feel really bad if like the government was keeping us from talking, right? Like it's almost impossible for somebody to fight you on that ground. And then there's a lot of like similar types of appeals you can make that like, oh wow, now your argument is really good, not because you're beating them over the head with some logic book, but because you're relating on other grounds, or you're winning on other fronts or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. So I mean, I don't even remember how we got here.
I think you're just complimenting me a lot. So yeah.
Oh yeah, fuck you. You still play boring league.
Okay, hold on. You were talking about how it's when it comes to like winning an argument. You brought up Wittgenstein said it's not about debate. It's about conversion, right?
Yeah, but I don't remember why we brought that up. That's the problem.
It's not about debate, it's about conversion. We were talking about epistemic divides before. I said that we live in different epistemic realities. When I'm arguing with like a Nazi, for instance, like they've already rejected everything outright because they've said like the JQ basically has like tainted everything. And then you said, yeah, this is why arguments aren't about like descriptive fact all the time, or this isn't why they're not just logic things, like it's about conversion, not...
Yeah.
Okay,
oh, well, I mean,
okay.
Sorry. But, okay, wait, there's other shit I want to talk to you about anyway, so it's fine. Okay. I want to talk to you quickly. Something that I think is really an interesting piece of work. I'm skipping over. Also, disclaimer for my own sanity. Okay. I'm covering like a lot of literature, which means I'm probably doing a shocking job at representing some of it. So when I mention something and I give the general gist of an idea, I'm really encouraging people to go and read it themselves.
Don't worry, someone's going to do a YouTube video review later of how you fucked up your representation.
I fucked up everything. I'm also looking for like a high effort Reddit post on how I'm wrong about every single gender theorist.
Yep.
Okay? I'm ready for you guys. It's fun. But when you talk about like not feeling particularly attached to your gender, there's a really interesting study or research piece, philosophical piece, I guess not research, done by someone called Naomi Shellman, who tries to think about the transgender experience based on her experience as a secular Jewish person. So she is Jewish because of ancestry, but doesn't practice religiously like Judaism, right? So she doesn't feel particularly attached to Judaism. She doesn't really feel like it's a huge part of her identity, but she is definitely a Jewish person and identifies with other Jewish people and would accept that identification, right? Okay. And there are definitely parts of her experience which are fundamentally Jewish. And then there are, of course, people who convert to Judaism later in life. Now, the problem with this analogy, all analogies suck to some extent. So the problem with this analogy, of course, is that there's the presence of choice, which isn't necessarily existing for transgender people. But a person who converts to Judaism later in life is also a Jewish person and feels a very strong connection to the Jewish religion and Judaism. And that person is as much a Jewish person as the secular Jewish person who doesn't feel any particular connection to Judaism. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, to focus on solidarity within a category rather than like the feeling of a concept.
So I hate the Judaism example just because Jew can also be an ethnicity as well.
But that's the point. Like,
I think people would view you differently, saying that like, so I theoretically could find a cute, wonderful Asian wife in Japan and marry her and become Japanese. And if somebody says like, oh, like what's your nationality? I say Japanese, and then they go, what's your ethnicity? I could never get away with saying Japanese. Well, unless that's the transracial argument is coming up next. But I could never say like ethnically, like, oh, I'm Japanese, right? Like even if I can identify 100% nationally with being Japanese, maybe if we say that's like the ontological thing, the being Japanese, I speak the language you do ever, but epistemically, like I am not like Japanese ethnically, like that is like a thing that I'm just not, because it doesn't conform with our understanding of like the ethnicity of Japanese, right? Or go.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think, and this is sometimes why it's confusing, is that we've really hammered in, and I totally understand why, in existential feminism on the sex gender distinction, right? I think race and ethnicity, or in the case of Judaism, like ethnicity and religion, like I think these two things are connected. In the same way that sex and gender do have a connection to one another. But I just think it's an interesting way that's more accurate in terms of like describing feeling. I don't think do I think it's a holistically good example? No, I think analogies generally are terrible. And I think going into the depths of like religion and culture and ethnicity, sort of beside the point. The point is that you can be Jewish and not have an attachment to it, or you can be Jewish and have a really strong feeling of that.
Yeah, I think so. The difference is just that, what is our understanding of like these particular words, I guess, is like, because it seems to be that, there's a couple things that you said earlier that I think we could probably, go a little bit deeper on. I think I know we agree on this. So for instance, like there are a lot of different social constructs, but not all social constructs are created equal, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a social construct in like the idea of the game of tag, like our roles there, but there's also a social construct in terms of like, you know, what do we consider a tree? Where does the matter that is a tree start and end? But like how much these two things like relate back to reality are two totally different things, right? The concept of a tree probably has like stronger ties to like the objective, factual, external world, assuming it exists, right? Than like the game of tag, which exists as like a human concept, right? Do we agree with that, or do we not agree with that?
Yeah, no, we.
Yeah. Oh, so then the only next thing I was going to say is that like it seems like not all, we're kind of circling back to some things earlier, but like not all forms. This goes back to not all forms of self-ID are the same. So for instance, if you wanted to ID culturally as a particular thing, without getting into too much, go for it.
I want to go into the transracial stuff because I want to talk to you. Like, I think it's the point you made. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand that transracialism has a history of being brought up by gender critical people, so transphobic people working within gender theory, and the association is to invoke the idea that transgender people are capricious and appropriative, that they transitioning because they want something out of the concept, right? And so I think, and then Kristen overall argues that analogy from the other side, but that's beside the point. So this is where it is really important to look at how social construction exists. So race, for instance, has multiple dimensions. There is legal race. So you can, it's not done anywhere near as much anymore, but obviously there was a period of time where people were legally assigned racial or ethnic identities, and you could then contest that assignment. So you could be assigned black and you could say, actually, like both of my parents are white, you know, like it might be like a one drop rule or something, right? Like these terrible racial laws that used to exist where racial categories were assigned, but they could be contested. Then there is social race, right? The idea that a lot of people can sort of leave their race by leaving a certain neighborhood, not practicing a certain culture, like associating with different people. Like these people can be seen as like race traitors because they don't associate with any of the culture and heritage that's associated with the race, right? And this is really important because racial identity has historically been understood as narrative. Your race doesn't exist in the moment. It depends on your heritage, which of course is super scrutinized the second your race comes into question, right? So like, for instance, even your identification with like Cuba, like how often when you bring that up are people like, well, do you speak Spanish? Or like, when's the last time you were there? Or like, what about your parents? Like, you know, racial identity is scrutinized because it is passed down through heritage, and it is also socially constructed very much within within a society, like a cultural society. And then, of course, there's the final part, which is physical race. And people do things all the time to change their physical race. They straighten their hair, they get nose surgery, they get eyelid surgery, they put on skin lightening creams. But the motivation for these procedures is rarely stated as, I truly want to be white. I believe that I am white and I am in the wrong body. That is like,
okay, wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, so I disagree that that's the main motivation for it. I don't think that that's the case.
No, I'm saying that never comes up.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
very
okay, gotcha.
rarely-
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah, okay, I agree then, yeah.
The people who are marketing these products have to go to great lengths to be like, oh no, it's not about like being white. It's not about like identifying with it's just about being confident. Like they have to push against this idea of race traitoring or whatever, whatever the word would be for that. And the thing that exists, and it's sort of used in gender, but it very much exists in the sphere of race, is passing, right? Anyone who was transracial would automatically be accused of passing, right? It would be less understood as, I truly believe that I am another race, and it would be more like, why are you trying to pass as that race? Why are you, passing as a white person when you know that you have this sort of heritage? So that is hugely different in terms of how we understand race. Sex, on the other hand, is a binary to begin with. It is not hereditary. It's not passed down from your parents. And it's mandatory. In all Western jurisdictions, people are assigned a legal sex. And these legal documents are then based on a lot of medical documentation. And so you have to change things medically in order to be recognized different legally. And so this force of like someone not really being a race and someone not really being a gender, they're constructed totally different.
Yeah.
I don't know if I made that clear. But the point is that you can't abstract sex and race from historical conditions which have created them and simply assume that history is irrelevant. And if you make the analogy between race and sex, you're actually in danger of not paying attention to those histories and how they actually change the ontological facts.
Sure. So then it might actually be the case that I don't know if we'll get into this, but we might not actually disagree on much then. I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of the ideas around transracialism, depending on who's talking. I don't like borrowing from the trans like vocabulary, because I feel like our engagement with our race is just absolutely different than our engagement with our gender or sex, basically.
But that's that's the point that Cressida Hayes, who does a lot of this work, makes, is that like, it's just not a good analogy. It usually is done in a way, often by gender critical thinkers, to suggest that trans women are trying to appropriate womanhood, right? And the idea that someone could be transracial makes no sense, because ultimately you're just going to be accused of passing, and it's so related to your heritage and your social identity. It's not some sort of like ontological, biological binary that you're fighting against.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I necessarily disagree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, we've cleared that up. You can't compare transgender and transracial.
Okay.
Done.
Cool. Yep. True.
Let me just check on. Okay, there are two more things I want to bring up, and then I can leave you alone, even though you left me waiting for so long.
I'm fine. I got all the time. Wait, do you have all? Wait, okay. It's really weird for your time. Hold on. Korea.
Yeah, it's 9 a.m. I need to leave at 10, but I don't even know. Like, I don't think that. I mean, we can force a disagreement.
Okay, you're fine. It's okay. You don't just calm down. You got plenty of time. Go for it. What
you can't do it. Did you? I'm a woman. Did you just tell me to calm down?
No, I told you calm down because you're speaking quickly. Why'd you assume it's because you're a woman? Yikes.
Okay, wow.
Oof, not a good look for you. Wow. Oh my gosh. You're acting kind of crazy right now,
okay.
But go ahead. Yep.
Are you gaswalling? No, okay. I'm not even doing it. Okay. So 2 things I want to look at. One is the argument about identifying with a gender is the same as identifying with a proper name. Like,
that's so fucking
as
stupid, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I disagree with that argument for obvious reasons, but it is related and makes me think of a cool argument that was put forward. Okay. Obviously, it was trashed, but I still want to tell you about it.
Okay.
Which was put forward by Jennifer Saul, which is called semantic contextualism, right? So a concept can either be governed by its contents. So I can share the same contents with other women, right? There are certain things that we all like, in some societies, they would say that a woman is always heterosexually attracted, right? Or a woman has big boobies. You know, there are these things that women have in common.
When we say content here, you're relating to like the ontology of woman in a particular culture. Yeah. Okay. Go.
Yeah. So that is one way that a concept can be governed by its contents.
Okay.
Right? But there's another way that a concept can work, which is by a rule. So Jennifer Saul said that we could use woman to operate like an indexical. So an example would be the use of the word I.
Oh, wait,
so
real quick, because no one in my chat knows what an indexical is, and you can explain it better than I can. So why don't you?
I'm going to I'll explain it through an example,
okay,
right? An indexical, for instance, it's like a rule governed term. So I is an indexical in that when I use the word I, the contents of what I'm referring to is totally different. I'm referring to me, Joanna. When you use the word I, you are referring to Stephen and all of the things that make you who you are. But both of us are still using the word in a way that makes sense. Both of us are still using it in a way that works within the English language because the rule changes the content depending on the context. So Jennifer Saul argued that X is a woman is true in the context C if X is a human who is relevantly similar to what is considered X in the context of C. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like I understand it, but I feel like I outwardly disagree with it.
Why do you disagree? A lot of people disagree, so I'm interested in why you disagree.
Yeah, I guess so. So I can understand the first thing, and that it feels like if we speak in any like first, second, or third person type of language that we can use, I'm almost thinking about it from like a computer, like functions and shit or whatever. But like if you say something like my home, two people can say my home, and that's different things. Or if I were to say like his car or their cat, like we can use the same words, we can utter the same things, but like the content is going to be different, but it's all still proper. Yeah. But when you're talking completely independent of yourself, so when you say, for instance, like a woman is X, if you haven't stated, or if there's not like built in implicitly some reference there, then you would assume that you're speaking from some third person objective frame of reference that makes this a different type of statement. The reference is the context of C. So the definition exists, right? So X is true. X is a woman is a true statement in the context of C. If X is a human who is relevantly similar to what is considered X in the context of C. So an ontological representation of what a woman exists, but it exists within the context of C. And for you to be a woman, you have to be similar to that concept within that context. Okay, I understand that and I agree with that. Okay, go for it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so this was huge, and people were like, this is so often what happens in philosophy. People were psyched about it. They were like, this is amazing because this gives metaphysical ground to the concept that a trans woman is a woman. It gives them metaphysical sort of...
But isn't this literally, again, just begging the question? Because now aren't we essentially, like, any time we say that, when we invoke this argument, aren't we just really asking what is the ontology of woman? And then, well, if it includes trans women, then you win, and if it doesn't, then you lose. So for instance, if I were to use this argument and I would say like, oh, like that person is a woman, and everybody around you disagrees, it's like, okay, well, what is the context or what is the ontology that you're invoking here to make that work? And it's like, oh, fuck, well, I guess I'm not. Like that's what it feels like to me. Go for it. 2-5
head. Can you just like? I'm getting to the criticism. I'm telling you my people.
Okay. Sorry, we were excited.
I get it. You're right. You're so smart. You're so good.
Okay, go ahead.
So people were excited because it meant that trans women could truly metaphysically claim to be women, right? However, the issue was, and so often at the time that this came out, the only way that trans women could identify as women was for political purposes. So this was big. But it does trivialize a trans woman's assertion that she's a woman because she's only a woman in certain contexts, right? So that's one. 2, it doesn't guard against context where content is viewed as super important. So anytime a political discussion is brought up, sports, restrooms, all of these say that content is important. So it actually has no political efficacy in these arguments. And there are a lot of contexts where trans women will in fact not be viewed as women, but cis women will have very little experiences where they're not viewed as women, which will then lead to transphobic questions of authenticity, where it's like, oh, well, yeah, you're a woman, but you're not as much of a woman as this other woman, right? So, I mean, I think it's a cool argument to think about the idea of like how indexical, like the idea of a rule to govern a concept over content governing a concept is a cool idea. But ultimately, you're right. It does end up being the fact that There's going to be different ontological formulations of the concept of woman in different contexts, which means that in certain contexts, trans women will be invalid, and that doesn't help us in the long run.
Yeah, and it almost seems like it would be basically the only times that argument would be relevant would be where the content or the ontological idea of a woman already includes trans women anyway, so you wouldn't even need to invoke the argument, is what it would feel like.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get to the point of like, you and I have spoken about the difference between a descriptive argument, so making very clear the state of things as they currently exist, and a proscriptive argument or prescriptive argument. And a lot of the work in gender metaphysics has pushed towards this idea of ameliorative inquiry or conceptual engineering, kind of making prescriptive arguments or proscriptive arguments about how gender should be viewed, right? And this is, I've been talking to my friends, they haven't been very responsive because I have some issues with ameliorative inquiry, in that to me it's very difficult to create a non-originating concept, right? So to change a concept and not create a brand new concept, right? So to change the concept of woman without creating
50
something
more
that is
types of
also
categories
named
of women.
Yeah. Something that's also we call it woman, but it's different. We know it's different, right? So to create a non-originating, to work on something to be non-originating and extending instead, we need to still defer to the existing understanding of that concept, right? Which is why I think moving outside of the binary, you can extend and you can blur the binary and you can change our conceptualizations of gender, but to completely say something like, and I truly don't believe that people outside of Tumblr say this, to truly identify as a table, it's nonsensical. It doesn't mean anything within the gender matrix. It doesn't do anything to the existing gender system. You're just out there by yourself, chilling, identifying as a table. And maybe that comes from maybe that's a little bit cynical because politically I'm very against the idea that your identity is political praxis and that shaping yourself into certain categories is somehow political work. But I truly do not,
right?
Yeah, I guess. I just think you need to understand that things like gender and race and identity categories do not exist for you in an atomized way. They are part of institutions and ideologies which everyone is a part of. And so you need to be
I don't disagree with that, but obviously it seems like there are other people to do it. Yeah, I mean, obviously I would have to agree with that, right?
Yeah, and so I'm saying if you are trying to ameliorate a category, if you are trying to create a category of woman that is more inclusive of trans women, I don't understand how identifying as something totally different is in any way changing the concept of woman or changing our understanding of gender. I think you still need to defer to a certain extent to the existing paradigm. Now, I could be totally wrong. I'm willing to be totally wrong on this, but I just I think we need to understand that while we can destabilize categories and reference the fact that they are illusions and not based on anything real and that they're malleable and we can change them, to an extent, stable categories are needed to make life livable. They're needed to get political representation. They're needed to get healthcare. They're needed to associate with one another. Stability in those categories isn't always malicious. Just because categories necessarily exclude doesn't mean that we disregard categorization altogether. That's just making an unworkable society. Every single gender theorist agrees with this.
Yeah, I think you would have to, right? If we assume that categories, which it seems we agree, categories are basically created for some purpose because it serves some human utility, then I mean, stable category almost tautologically requires stability. Otherwise, it's not a category, right? It's just some amorphous super whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I love the idea of conceptual engineering and ameliorative inquiry. I love the idea of changing concepts. I just think two things. We need that ethics of transformation that Cressida Hayes talks about, checking that we are transforming in the right way, not the wrong way. And that we're still making sure that the categories are politically useful or useful in the ways that we need them to be useful. And that we're not originating brand new concepts. And just proliferating concepts which don't actually address the question we had at the beginning, which is trans women are women. And if you start creating new concepts, which maybe they and I think I mentioned before, there is some cool I know Doe, I've not spoken to Doe, but it seems to be quite well read on things like Althusser and like Marxist philosophy. I don't really like Althusser. He strangled his wife. I know that's a bad reason to hate a philosopher, but I can be fickle. But like a lot of that Marxist sort of framing, and Althusser does come before Butler, I guess, to a certain degree. But to me, the better argument for sort of like non-traditional creative gender expression would be like Andelzua and Lugones, and the idea of like living in the borderlands and speaking from the perspective of being marginalized and resisting through your own experience, resisting oppressive ideology. I don't necessarily agree with that. I just think it would be a better philosophical foundation. So if people are interested in that, that would be the place to look.
Sure. What do you think about the concept of like male lesbians or female femboys?
Yeah, I love it. Because gender is detached from sex to a certain extent. And I think it can be like, this is what originally inspired Butler to do it.
Wait.
Right?
So real quick, when we say male lesbian, we're not talking sex there. We're talking gender. Gendered male lesbians. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does either word mean at that point, I guess? Because now we're getting into the private. Like, if somebody were to utter that phrase to me, male lesbian, I'm assuming an absurd phrase that has literally no meaning to anything.
Okay, so then we need to go back to the sort of argument that Jennifer Saul was putting forward behind, right? Semantic contextualism. The idea that, like, for instance, in drag culture, men often refer to each other using she, her, totally normal within that context, right? It's not that they necessarily view themselves as female or that their gender is woman. It's that is how the pronoun functions. So just because private language is not the same as suggesting that languages change within context. So, for instance, in
terms of like the cross-dresser, the drag thing. So this is actually completely changed in the past 10 or 20 years. Would you agree that if I was in a play and I was playing a female character and I dressed up like a woman and people referred to me as she, her, and I refer to myself as a woman, do you agree that there's a difference between that, that I'm using performance in the layman's term there, in terms of that performance versus like being a woman? Do you think there's a difference between those two things? Okay.
There's a huge difference. Wait, slow your roll. Your roll.
Well, because when you bring up the drag queen thing, that's something that I would explicitly say. Okay, well, you brought up, well, they say she, her, so they're like women. I don't think that drag queens are women. Go. Okay.
I didn't say that. You didn't let me finish because you got so high.
Okay, go.
So, if, for instance, in this setting, I were to use the word poggers, you understand what I'm saying. If I said poggers to my mum, she would have no idea what I was saying, right?
Sure.
That doesn't mean that poggers exists in a private language. That means that it is a language that is used by a certain community, okay? So, in the context of drag, which is different from cross-dressing, which is different from acting in a performance, right? I've played a dude in a play. That doesn't make me a dude. However, drag performance, and this is also why people mess up performativity, because Judith Butler was looking at queer performances of gender and talking about gender performativity in two different ways. So that's why it gets mixed up. But drag as an art form is the subversion of gendered performance. So it is making fun of heterosexual sort of ideology and frameworks and how gender works within that framework, right? So it's different to just playing a dude on stage or in a movie, because you are actively playing up the gendered aspect of that performance, right? So in that case, they use she and her, not because they identify as women or have any sort of like deep gender identity as a woman. It's just because that's how language is used in that place, because it's queer gender.
Yeah.
It's gender that is no longer used in the normal way. And this is where Judith Butler said that we could actually see real subversions of gender. She was looking at how queer people use gender. So she was looking at butch lesbians who referred to themselves as daddies and who like to use he, him pronouns because they were, and this is when we come back to that ethics of transformation as well, they were reinforcing ideas of like heterosexual relationships and this idea that,
sure.
They
wait,
were.
So I want to ask on that question, okay? I've known two butch lesbians in my entire life, so I don't have like the anecdotal thing to draw around, but even those people acted in a pretty masculine way, or maybe a very masculine way, and I never saw them engage romantically, so maybe they would. It wouldn't surprise me if they had their partners call them like daddy or something. But they absolutely still consider themselves women, like she, her. Like there was no, yeah. So when I ask in terms of like this male lesbian thing, like in what context does that phrase ever make sense? Because if the person legitimately identifies as a woman, like male lesbian there just seems to be like a fun phrase to use for somebody that is dressing a different way, but it doesn't actually have like any deeper meaning to it. But when people utter the phrase male lesbian, it seems like they mean something a little bit deeper than that.
To me, so I can't, okay, I wish I could remember. And it's because all of their last names start with H that I cannot, okay? But either Jacob Hale or Jay Halberstam wrote a book called Female Masculinity. And it was about this exact thing. It's about this border zone, which is demilitarized as far as like that's what the ultimate thing is. Of course, male lesbian makes no sense to you. You're not in queer culture, right? In terms of like you're not engaging with a male lesbian. But within lesbian culture, if someone is like a male lesbian, that doesn't mean that they're not a woman. It just means that there's a masculinity that they really identify with.
Why would you say male lesbian? Culture. Why would you say male lesbian then instead of masculine lesbian? Like you're using male then in a way that just
different people do. I mean, I just think this is the thing about queer gender and the potential in that area is that it is queering the concepts, not to make them nonsensical, but just to change our ideas of like what gender is.
Yeah, I guess.
But I don't think that works.
Yeah, like
globally.
So. Yeah, if you were to float this idea past me that male lesbian is basically just a for fun phrase that like maybe queer people use in certain interactions or whatever, but it's not actually like a descriptor of like sex or gender and then the sexual orientation of lesbian. It's just kind of like a different thing. I mean, I guess
it's not fun. I mean, I guess it's like somewhere in between fun. God, what is it?
Well, because you're telling me here that word male, that's not supposed to map on to sex or gender. And in which case, I don't know what male means, right? You're using it.
It maps onto masculinity, like gender.
But but to be clear, masculinity is not. Masculinity? Yeah. Well, and even more importantly, because this is what I'm stressing, masculinity is not male, right? So a woman, for instance, that is outside, who's dirty and fixing her car, she's not performing as a male, or she's not acting male, or she's not male in that moment. She might be exhibiting some masculine performance or masculine trait or whatever. I don't think I'm using performance in the philosophical way that you're using it, but like she's not being a male, she's just masculine. So that's why it seems like when you utter the phrase male lesbian, whatever male means there is totally disconnected from any other conversation outside of just a literal like fun nicknaming scheme which adds a whole other layer of confusion to everything, right? Yeah.
I guess it does because it's like context sensitive language use, but also it's the idea of like, I view sexuality largely in terms of desire, but there is an identity aspect to sexuality as well, right? Mm-hmm. So identifying as a male lesbian might, and I'm not sure like the context in which you heard this used, but if I was in like a queer context and I heard that someone was a male lesbian, I would assume that they are a lesbian who exhibits masculinity and prefers to play the male role in the heteronormative fucking matrix that sometimes goes through queer culture where someone plays a male role and someone plays a female role.
Wouldn't we just say traditionally like Butch and Dyke in that point? Like why, like it feels like you're just taking Butch and you've renamed it.
Butch and Dyke, no, because Butch and Dyke refer to aesthetics as well. So you could have a male lesbian who looks incredibly feminine, but they play the daddy role, and so they call like this is so confusing. I don't know why you would use the word male here. It's such a bizarre word. And you've got us into this weird place, right? Because there's like the blues, Stone Cold, Stone Butch blues, like Leslie. There's all this literature around like Butch, Dyke, male lesbians, and female masculinity, and all of these. Someone sent me an Urban Dictionary thing. A male lesbian is a physiologically heterosexual male who so it's a meme.
Well, I would be very careful about. Well, there's because I read about because people were tweeting when I was this is another separate thing, but I took issue with femboys that were trans women. In my opinion, you can't be a femboy if you're a trans woman. Like a femboy is somebody that identifies as male. Absolutely not. Absolutely, I'll fight you on that one.
Sorry, I got confused. You can be a trans man and be a femboy.
Yes. but not a trans woman and a femboy.
Okay.
But people were arguing that you could
be
a trans woman and be a femboy, in which case, like, what the fuck? None of these words mean anything. And then people, as in response to that tweet, started to link me. There's like an LGBT Wikipedia or whatever, and it has like an entry under like under male lesbian. It's not just like an Urban Dictionary meme thing or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. But these are also, to be clear, also, these are very esoteric, like, these are very off the norm. Like, I understand that this is, yeah, go ahead.
This is what Hale and Halberstam agreed upon in the first place, which is what I brought up earlier, which is the fight over whether someone is a trans woman or a femboy and whether they can occupy both identities at once. That just needs to be completely demilitarized. It doesn't matter. That margin, the truth is that people can exist in multiple worlds at once and be marginalized in both. And like, this is what Maria Lugones talks about in terms of like world traveling and world crossing. Like, you can be different identities and both be like marginalized as a woman and marginalized as a man. And so in different worlds, you might occupy different identities. And the ultimately what might work is to just abandon the conversation altogether and let people who live in borders live and just stop trying to police their identity.
Can I float an idea? Now, I understand that I'm a little bit off the norm in terms of how I like to do things. So maybe this is totally unrealistic, or maybe it's even dumb. I would like to say I think identities are stupid. Okay.
I think identities are stupid too, but there's a teleological reason to have them in terms of like, there are certain identities that are treated like.
Yes, I agree with that. But I'll utter that, but let me qualify it a little bit. Okay, there are some identities that are probably necessary because they convey a great deal of utility behind them. So identifying as a male or female in society right now seems to be like a pretty necessary thing. Identifying as a certain race within the context of your society maybe might be like a certain thing. Or convey like a whole bunch of utility. But I feel like the goal in general, now this is like personally prescriptive for me and what I would tell other people like on a personal level. I don't know society-wide if this works, but it feels like your goal should be to have as few quote unquote identities as possible because they feel more exclusionary than like than giving any kind of utility. So let me give like an example that's totally unrelated from all of this, right? So this is gonna sound like really silly, but like there are huge fights between like PC gamers and console gamers, or there was a long time ago. It used to be a big deal, right? Now, I would always say that like, oh, I like to play PC games, but I would never identify as a PC gamer because that identity carries with it so much baggage and so much exclusionary stuff. It's like, this is so stupid. Or I would say like, I'm somebody that likes to play like music, but I wouldn't call myself like a musician. Or I'm somebody that likes to play this or do that, but I wouldn't call myself like these things. It feels like we become more and more, I don't want to use the word identitarian because that sounds like a huge Nazi calling card, but it feels like we become more obsessed with like trying to pile on more and more and more and more and more identities. We're in this weird world where instead of saying that like I say weird, that's really loaded, but instead of saying like, oh, like there are lots of different types of lesbians or whatever, now it's like there are male lesbians, where it feels like we've piled on like so many identities that it's like holy fuck, I don't even know what the fuck anything is anymore. And I'm like, and I spend a lot of time reading about this stuff, so I can't even imagine what like the normal person, I don't like these normal, I know these words are loaded, I'm doing this because I'm talking to you, okay? But like what like, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. But what like a heteronormative, identity normative, Western normative, whatever person would hear these things and they're completely lost. I have no idea. And I feel like the assuming of so many different identities rather than just kind of like broadening the scope of a lot of the identities that already exist, I feel like in ways that's actually harmful because we're narrowing the scope of like what an identity can even be.
I mean, I agree with you, but from a totally different political position, one that I know you would completely reject, just based on. That's okay. It's, hey, we end up in the same place, so it doesn't matter.
It
right?
absolutely matters. What a horrible thing for you to say. I can't believe you would say that, but go ahead.
So I think identities, as I've said before, the categories were made for us. We weren't made for the categories. So they don't map onto us perfectly. We require stable categorization to an extent to make life livable because there are reasons we need categories for teleological purposes, so like defined by the ends, right? So as a woman in a world where, I mean, I know you're a rape apologist, but as a woman in a world where women get constantly, I'm kidding.
No, it's like I came out as pro-rape like 3 days ago, so go for it, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
I didn't, I'm glad I'm not like doxing you. Or,
yeah, no problem. Yeah, don't worry. I've got a lot of public and private things. This is a public thing, so go for it. Yeah, all right.
Okay, cool. Oh, no. Okay, so like there are things that are needed in terms of political gains where it helps me to have solidarity with other women and express my my issues that affect me because of my status as a woman. So this is something really interesting that you brought up as well. Both categories are used both in terms of me being able to be represented and advocate for myself, but those same categories are also used to oppress and discriminate against me. So the category is not good or bad because it's both used to marginalize me and to advocate to stop that marginalization. So that's a bit, categories are fucked like that. Categories are necessarily exclusionary. They will always exclude someone. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Our brains, you can't get past categorization. Our brains naturally do it. It's a cognitive economy. We cannot take in stimuli individually and assess it completely by itself. That's just not how we work as human beings.
Sure, but so something that I would kind of like point out here too is that, so I understand that there are, earlier you uttered a phrase that I pushed back on a little bit. No, so it was the concept of like, I think you said that you don't believe that it's good to have identities for like political reasons. And I said, yeah, but sometimes I think a lot of people wonder that or push back against that. And now it feels like I'm hearing this idea. I'm not trying to say you're contradicting yourself. I'm just pointing out like I'm trying to understand.
And I can clarify that. Anyway.
So now we say that like, well, there are some identities that we could assume for political gain. And that seems like a scary concession to make because then like these concepts of identities become less about like the primary gain, I guess, of like, if I identify as a cancer patient, I can get chemotherapy. If I identify as a trans woman, I can get, GIS, HRT, SRS. Now it's like, well, if I identify as this more amorphous thing, there's like some secondary political gain. The way that people treat me or whatever is going to differ. And now I'm getting advantages based on these secondary, the secondary gain that comes along with these other types of identities, which I think is something that people argue about. That's obviously a huge conservative and TERF and trans-medicalist like calling card, right? The idea that trans women identify as women just for the gain of being a secondary gain of being treated as a woman.
Appropriation thing, right? And that's like why transracialism as an analogy is harmful because it's suggesting that you're trying to appropriate womanhood. When so that's a really good point you made up. So I brought that up in relation to Jennifer Saul and her semantic contextualism and the fact that trans women under semantic contextualism can identify as women because they metaphysically are women, not because of political purposes. So there is an advantage to being able to say that you truly are something, not that you are something for political purposes.
Yeah.
Now, that is to do with category identification. In terms of the existence of concepts, I'm arguing that a lot of concepts are inherently political. They only exist because we live in a juridical state where we are represented based on the categories we fall into. I disagree with identity, like extensive identity categorization, because I think it's deeply liberal and disconnected from systems. And I think we're coming from this place where we more and more view ourselves as these like atomized things. And so we claim all of these identities so that we can be represented under liberalism because that's the only way that we're heard. So that's why I agree with you. Identity sucks in terms of like extensive categorization, but I think we come from completely different areas because I know that you really value liberalism, whereas I think that ultimately too much liberalism can lead us to completely divide and just focus on ourselves as individuals. And I think that leads to extensive identity categorization.
Yeah, we're probably closer than maybe either of us think in that. So if you would have talked to me 7 years ago, I was hyper liberal, like very much like individualist. Everybody ought to be blah, 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 blah. As I've gotten older and matured, I realized, okay, well, there's probably like some forms of this like kind of like social identity that exist that have an incredible amount of utility to like 99% of humans. So it's kind of stupid to tell people to disregard that. I've come to understand these more and more. I do feel sometimes though that like we're getting into like weird, like other life advice territory, not necessarily related to philosophy, but I guess like, yeah, on this level, like sometimes I feel a little bit sad when it feels like people assume certain identities and that kind of locks them into having certain ideas and opinions or things they can enjoy. And that's something that I try to push back on. So like the idea that like a jock can't play video games, or the idea that like a video game nerd, can't go to the gym, or the idea that somebody that enjoys, like football on TV can't also go to like a classical music concert. Like those are the types of identities I push on, because it seems like oftentimes they become like really, really restrictive, and that just kind of makes me sad, I guess. Yeah.
And that also is really important in terms of like defining what is ontological and what is like more aesthetic, right? Like I think there's a clear divide between like a social role that is like aesthetic and has rules related to it in terms of like, oh, I'm preppy, right? Versus I'm a woman. I think there is a distinction between those two things. But ultimately, I agree with you, even if we were talking about ontological categories or like we were talking about things like, so for instance, I have rheumatoid arthritis, so I have autoimmune conditions. And if when I was younger, I spiraled because I didn't really understand my own condition. I was reading online and it was like, if you do this, you could hurt yourself and injure your body forever. If you do this. So I was like, okay, like I was a competitive martial artist. I was like, I got to stop martial arts. I got to stop all of this stuff. Like I can't do this anymore. My life is over. Like nothing is going to be enjoyable anymore because I let the diagnosis sort of define who I was. And it wasn't until like years later. I don't even want to get into this with you.
Because you're really rubbing on the borders of that. Like, well, I have OCD, ADHD, depression. I have to be this thing for the rest of my life. And if anybody suggests any type of change, but we won't get into that. But okay, go ahead. I very much empathize with what you're saying that. Yeah.
Just quickly on that. To the start, I'm like walking around it. Okay, so there's something I'd like to touch on that also isn't that, but I do want to touch on it, which is
okay. You're leaning over the pool right now. You're about to fall right into it, but go ahead, try to touch it.
I'm not. Right. I'm not. I don't lean in. I'm not a liberal feminist.
Okay.
But when it comes to common sense advice, like don't go outside when you're 90 pounds, for instance.
Wait, I never said that, but go ahead. We're clear.
Oh, really? That's just how it came down the grapevine.
Oh, down the grapevine. Oh, well, the original tweet was, it's not a good idea to go outside on your own and get really intoxicated in strange places with strangers. That was the original tweet, by the way. Now, somehow down the grapevine, that got interpreted to, if you're a 90-pound woman, you should literally never leave your house. It's strange how that works, but sorry, go ahead, continue. I just wanted to make sure that you understood the original statement. Go ahead.
No, I was pulling your leg.
Okay, gotcha.
No, but the point I'm trying to make in terms of that is like there is like there is a practical element to that sort of advice, of course. And I totally agree with the first piece of advice you had. What you said later on, I disagree with a little bit more. Even though
Okay, go ahead.
Wait, because, and it comes back to like, the last thing we spoke about, right? It's not that I disagree with the practical element of what you're saying. It's that sometimes when we give practical advice, it can change the way that the issue is perceived. Of course, there is practical utility in telling people, like, don't go out and get wasted by yourself. That's not safe. But the issue is that if we consistently repeat this, we obfuscate the issue that, for instance, a woman is the most unsafe in her home at the hands of her family and loved ones, right? And so, you tell people to be careful in public, you eradicate the fact that most women are not attacked by strangers, right? And the more that we extrapolate this idea that women are constantly in danger of being attacked by an evil stranger, the more we obfuscate the real threat that women are most likely to be harmed by someone that they know very, very well. And in doing so, we also give the government the ability to paternalistically put in policies which limit women's freedom of movement because women are unsafe and we have to protect them from those strangers on the street who are out to get them. When in actual fact, the truth of the matter is, yes, of course, if you are 90 pounds and you can't defend yourself and you go out and get wasted with a bunch of strangers, you are putting yourself in unnecessary danger. That is true of anyone. Right? But it is particularly true of women because how we are vulnerably constituted within society.
Sure. And I understand that, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, I understand that for sure. I'm trying to talk around. Well, I don't care. I'll swim in the deep section. I'm trying to stand at the edges. I think we mentioned, we very lightly, with a very gentle princess brush, brushed across this topic in our previous conversation where it's irritating sometimes that it feels like I worry sometimes, actually, I don't know if I gave these examples before. I worry sometimes that people are so concerned with what they want the world to be that our advice is geared more towards that than what exists sometimes. I'll get off of the rape stuff completely, actually, and I'll go to like the relationships or more specifically the sex the sex subreddit, I see this happen a ton. So a woman will come in and I don't know if I brought this example up with you last time or not, but a woman will come in and she'll say something like, I have huge labia, or one of my breasts is like 3 cup sizes smaller than the other. Or a guy will come in and he'll say like, I have, like a 2-inch penis, or, I have like really weird shading or coloring or bumps on the bottom of my dick, whatever. And, somebody will, the question will be like, is anybody going to be concerned about this? Or is this something I have to deal with? Like, is this something I should tell my partner about? And overwhelmingly, almost every single time, the most upvoted response is,
fine.
yeah, exactly. No one will care. It's fine. It's blah, blah. And it's like, no, that's not true at all. Like you're going to run into, I feel like I get upset sometimes because it feels like people aren't being given good advice. And this is kind of what we talked about last time, where like there is no real culture on giving advice. It's literally just like, what is the acceptable reaction for people to have? And then we pretend that the unacceptable reaction doesn't exist, even if that literally might be the norm, like the 80% plus response right now. Yeah, and that's something that upsets me. So like when I see like thread after thread after thread of like any woman should be able to go out anywhere she wants and get as drunk as she wants with no problem. It's like, yeah, sure, but holy fuck, that we're nowhere near that. That's not happening probably in our lifetime. Yeah. And even as a man, I don't know if I would even like.
It's true. Mm-hmm. That's my point. It's like it's not safe for anyone to do that. That's creating a dangerous situation, right? That doesn't mean that it will necessarily happen, but you've created unsafe conditions, right? That's true for everyone. And I agree that sometimes people lean in hard on this like utopian idea of how we want things to be, and so they abandon the descriptive and they give horrible advice.
Yeah. Wait.
My
can
argument
you give me hold that argument? Can you give me like 2 minutes? 1 second. Hold on. 1 second. Okay.
Oh my fucking God. First he leaves me for League, 45 minutes so he can lose a round of League, dogged for League, the most boring content ever, right? First I get dogged for lead. Now, what is he fucking getting a pizza? What's the bet he's getting a drink? What's the bet there's someone at his door? This is typical low value male shit. God. I actually can't believe it. Wow. That's fine. I'll just sit here, I guess. I don't play League, so I can't bore my chat to death while he's away.
Okay, I wanted to give you time to prepare a really good answer, okay? Go for it. Okay.
I forgot what you asked me.
What? Are you serious? Are you even listening to our conversation?
Nah. Okay.
So it had to do with people giving reasonable advice. You talked about like, no one should go outside.
I already have an answer. I don't need to think about it. I'm brilliant. Okay. So yes, obviously people give advice for a utopian reality that is in no way descriptive of the current reality we live in. And I don't want this to be another call-in stream where I tell you how to run your Twitter, right? I know what you're doing.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, we're not.
I don't follow the fucking omniliberal because I think that person is a loser, right? But like, I'm not going to tell anyone. Anyone what to do online, right? I think everyone on Twitter is an absolute idiot. I think it's a stupid place. Even I'm an idiot on Twitter, right? So I don't take anything there seriously. Okay. However, I do think that there are material realities connected to what happens online. And I do think when you're on stream, you're such a nice guy. You're so reasonable. And I think this is a really great place to give that sort of advice. And I think Twitter is a really shocking place to give that kind of advice.
That's good. So I'm glad I bring more people over from the Twitter onto my stream after we have these conversations. But okay, I got you.
Yeah.
We don't have to go.
Yeah, go ahead. Wait. The other thing is, you know what? It doesn't fucking matter because I know what you're doing on Twitter. So like, it's a non-starter. I understand what's happening there. But I do think sometimes, like for instance, that woman that you responded to, I don't follow you, but clearly I check it. That woman you responded to was like, I was alone and I was afraid and he gave me that look, blah, blah, blah. And you responded in some catty, I don't remember what you said, but it was like,
oh my God, Queen, how did you survive? Oh no. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, obviously.
Base, right? I know. Base, absolutely. Yeah.
Obviously nothing happened there, right? But you responded to the logical side of that argument, the experiential side of that argument, when really someone was expressing a feeling that they felt unsafe and they felt like horrible and they felt like upset. And I don't think that is constituted as trauma, but like I do think that
I think that
you can acknowledge someone's feelings without it being traumatic.
Yeah, well, without getting into the psych side, hold on, Zarko, what the fuck do you want?
I'm on her side.
Okay, just chill. This guy massively trolls. Okay, make sure it doesn't derail. Okay, Just from the psychological side of things, my issue with her tweet wasn't that she had like a traumatic response to something. It was the justification of it, which made it sound like okay. You have to leave in 25 minutes.
Justification. Sorry.
What? Yeah, okay, sorry. So here's my issue, okay? So backing up a little bit. A traumatic response is by definition not like a rational response to something, right? That's why they're traumatic responses. If it was a reasonable response, then we would say that it's reasonable, right? So when somebody has a traumatic response to something, and then they go on to justify that response, that's damaging for two reasons, I think. One, it reinforces their own trauma. And two, in some ways, it makes it feel like that trauma is like a socially, like something that people should be worried about.
Okay, and I totally agree with that. That is not what you responded.
No, but the problem with her initial tweet was...
Yeah?
Are you done? Okay. The problem with her initial tweet wasn't that like, oh my God, there was a guy and I saw him and he reminded me of my rapist and it like, it like upset me. The problem was she was saying things like, he asked for my number 3 times and he talked to me and I didn't want him to. And that reminded me of rapist. It made it sound like she was having a reasonable response to something that was like an incredible level of harassment that she was receiving. And the people in her replies echoed just as much. So my issue with it was that people were acting like if a guy asks you for your number a few times in a bar, it's reasonable to have like such a traumatic response that you have to like call a cab, go home and cry for the rest of the night, which is totally unreasonable, I think. That was the issue that I took with her. Yeah.
I agree, but I think that your response does exactly what you're criticizing her original tweet for doing.
Which is what?
Which is you're suggesting in her original tweet that it can be read as justifying the idea that trauma can distort perfectly reasonable behavior, right? I'm saying your tweets can often be read as justifying quite patriarchal and oppressive current understandings of situations. Even if that's not what you mean. Even if what she means is I was traumatized because somebody looked at me and it reminded me of my rapist, and then everyone was like, yes, people should not ask you for your number. You're so right, Queen. How traumatic for you. Glad you're okay. Take a bath tonight, right? And that's how they're reading it. The same way you are saying very practically, people can be in danger if they go outside and get wasted with strangers. If you're 90 pounds and a woman, don't go outside and get drunk. I know what you mean as practical advice, but that can just as easily be read as, oh my God, you're right. Women are never safe anywhere. Women are constantly vulnerable. If they want to be safe, they should just stay inside, right? So all I'm saying
bullshit. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. You're on some other shit if that's how you read that. Fuck that.
I didn't read it that way.
No, you
because I know
did.
that
Whoa, hold on. Excuse me.
Okay.
I was using a semantically different context there. Okay.
Semantic contextualism.
Yeah, the semantic contextualism was different. When I said you there, I didn't mean you, obviously. Come on, try to keep up. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Mea culpa. Jeez, I couldn't keep up. No, I actually seriously don't give a shit about your Twitter.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's why we're still friends, right?
Probably.
Okay. Anything else you got?
Nah.
What about his private poems?
This guy is literally a troll. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Well, hey, thanks a lot for the conversation.
Well, thank you for chatting, even though you came 45 minutes late. Whatever, it's no big deal.
Fuck you. All right, be careful. Love you,
bye.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
Oh no.